So the justice angle, who is most vulnerable, who is most responsible? And then what can we do? I mean, that's the whole point of advocacy, of course, is where can we intervene to protect the most vulnerable and also to hold those most responsible accountable? And even, I mean, most of my talk today is going to focus on mitigation and how we can actually keep this. That's what we can do at this point, keep this from getting worse. That's kind of where we are. So let's just look at the inequities of climate change. That is, how the most vulnerable are going to be really the most affected by what's up ahead and what has already happened, in fact. So one of these things that is already getting worse and slated to get even worse is intensifying droughts. This is the quote from the August report. More intense drought in many regions because of how the water cycle is being intensified, sort of ratcheted up. So you look at this world. First, I want to talk about worldwide the consequences, because there's a huge global north, global south divide in terms of who is going to suffer what. Of course, a lot of this is caused by us in the global north, but it's the global south that is already bearing the burden of the consequences. And these are already unfolding in some of the most afflicted parts of the world. This climate and food vulnerability index gives you is one effort to sort of judge, who's getting hit the worst, who's the most vulnerable. And you can see it's mostly African nations at the top. You also along with Yemen and Haiti and a few others. So let's look at one of these quickly. Burundi is the worst on a number of measures. It's the number 113 of all the ones rated on this index. Now, part of that is because so much of its population depends on agriculture, and agriculture itself is so vulnerable to drought, especially if you're in part of the world where there are these conditions that incline the region to drought anyway. Their droughts are getting worse in North Burundi already here in 2021. They've had a 10-year drought. Last 3 years, it's intensified in some places. The growing season is really shrinking and getting drier. And already, this corner of the world has the world's highest prevalence of chronic malnutrition. This is pretty amazing that they're feeling it already. They're really getting hammered. And sort of ironically, but I don't know, it's not, it's just horrifyingly, I think, that they actually have the smallest carbon footprint. So they're the least responsible for this global shift. And yet they're the ones that are getting it hardest. And, wow, that just boggles my mind. Look at another issue, rising sea levels. So this is the sea level rise according to the IPCC report. This is actually, it's risen 8 inches. This is 0.1588 inches in the past century. It will last since 2000, the rate of increase has doubled. So it's accelerating. And already this is faster than any preceding century, in millennia. Now the intermediate, this is the intermediate. So this is the in-between, which is probably the most likely at this point or higher, it's gonna keep rising, and that rise is gonna accelerate to 1.33 meters. Oh, I had a picture of just to give you a sense of, a meter is about as high as the doorknob on a door. So you put that over against these pictures. These are some of the island nations that are vulnerable: Maldives, Tuvalu, most of these in the South Pacific. You can see just how vulnerable they are, just eyeball it. So island nations are especially vulnerable. I think another study just recently, 97% of the population in island nations is vulnerable to these to the sea level rise that is predicted. So these nations, many of them are going to be hard hit and even vanish as a result. The other way that the most vulnerable of the world are going to be hard hit is in these coastal cities in the global south, like Manila in the Philippines. A lot of the way these cities grow is through informal settlements on the edges, and a lot of the edge land that is open to that, the informal settlements by people who are poor coming in from the countryside. A lot of that land is low-lying land and vulnerable to flooding already. So you have these huge communities that are potentially going to just be washed away by this level of this extent of sea level rise. And where are they going to go? What are they going to do? So a lot of vulnerability that is really skewed toward the least of these within these countries as well. So I wanted all of those effects, those skewed effects are happening in the US as well. And I could go into a lot of examples there. I did want to bring up one example that I haven't talked about, the intensifying storms that already we find, this is from the IPCC report, and this intensifying water cycle brings more intense rainfall and more intense storms. Typhoons in the last 40 years are already shown to be more intense. And these extreme sea level events, that's something we've seen. This is actually Hurricane Ida, which killed 45 people in New York and New Jersey alone just this past month, I think it is. And this is a picture of what it did in New York City. It closed down the subway. You guys know all this, but it's here. It's on our doorstep. So these storms are also hitting some of us harder than others. And I've done some work with some students on the Superstorm Sandy and its differential impacts. And we found that this is within greater New York, that the hardest hit were actually the minority communities and then low income communities. And so you can see, like, the inundated schools here they're concentrated in African American parts of New York in the boroughs, and similarly with the housing damage by block, many of the lower income tracts are the ones that are most affected. It's also also have trouble because they have fewer resources. They have trouble recovering, and so there's a longer recovery time and a more struggle to recover within these communities. So resources make a great deal of difference in the least of these. It's pretty much established in the social science literature disaster that's it, because of all their other vulnerabilities, that the least of these are more vulnerable to any kind of disaster, including those up ahead for climate change. So let me just get into the question of responsibility. Given that climate change, the whole thing is falling on the shoulders of people who are already the least privileged and least resourced in our world and in our societies. What can we do? And I think part of this, a lot of what you see out there on the internet and so on, it focuses on us as individual consumers. That is important. I mean, to look at our carbon footprints, our individual carbon footprints, and to see, what we're doing in terms of the food we eat, in terms of the stuff we buy, how we get around the world to work and play and so on. Home heating is a big piece of this. For us Americans, transportation and the stuff we buy are the biggest slices of this. Depends on where you live, of course. But I think it's also these larger forces and these sort of accumulated history that shape and constrain what our choices actually are. And I think we need to also be thinking, not just as consumers. Green consumerism is not going to get us out of this phase. We also need, public and political advocacy, I think. And that's really a big part of the mix for me in terms of how do I portion my time as someone who cares about this issue. So who is responsible by nation? This is sort of the traditional way that the United Nations and climate negotiators divvy things up. And here the US is overwhelmingly, in terms of the last century and a half that are really responsible for this problem, the US is the biggest culprit. Kind of by far, even though China, as you can see in this graph, has now overtaken the US in its overall emissions, that is only in the last, less than a decade that China has surpassed the US in terms of greenhouse emissions. That throughout, really the 20th century, the US was the dominant contributor, and that really has added up. So it's our carbon, our, methane, well, mostly the carbon that is now pushing this climate scenario into more dire territory. Us more than any other nation in the world. Now, you can also do this another way, which I think is also informative. You can divvy it up by industry, by human activity. And when you do this, when you do something like figure out how much oil and gas and coal and so on, these companies have been extracting out of the earth and then pumping into our societies and making profit out of it. When you figure it that way, in terms of companies responsible, it really starts to look more human scale. Just 100 companies responsible for 71% of the global emissions. This also kind of boggles my mind. I mean, yeah, okay, so we were consuming what they made, and so we bear some responsibility. But these are the guys who really pushed to have us be consumers. And they lined up all these allies across the society, all these other institutions sort of fell in line with their sort of profit making. And so I think there's a lot of sort of culpability here that I think is historic and just long term, and really looks a lot to me like what the tobacco industry did back when they got all these profits, and it turned out that their product caused cancer. I mean, it's a little more indirect, the causation, but certainly the science is there now. So that's an interesting angle on responsibility. All right, so wow, I'm getting, let me just fly through some of this. So I think tending to our individual carbon footprints is one thing we can do. And, but it's a little disempowering to think that, oh, if I just carpool at least once a week, that's going to fix it. But it's also out of proportion to the scale of this problem, the enormity of it. And I think that is kind of disabling. That's one of the reasons I think that sort of green consumerism is not going to do it. It's also that, the people who can afford to be greenest these days are the people who are the richest, and the people who are the poor people in our society are the least able to do the consumery things like listed here because of resources and so on. So I think it is incommensurate, and it doesn't get at all those forces in history that have shaped and constrained our current choices. So I think we need collective action. One of the ways that is there available for Presbyterians is this Earth Care Congregations program run by the PCUSA, and we have, I'll take a little bit in the end here about what we at Bethany have done with this. But it gives you a good sense of all the things you can do as a congregation to address your carbon footprint, your collective carbon footprint as a congregation. So in the fields of worship, education, facilities, and outreach as they divide it up. Now, I think we at Bethany, we started this in 2012, and it did sort of get us into some new activities, and I think it kind of raised awareness. We did the education and worship pieces too. But I'm a little critical of this program because we are a small congregation and we only have our resources for doing this kind of work are pretty limited. For something like solar panels, we're pretty financially strapped. And so I think It's also, though, I think it's a little bit sort of indwelling to focus just on the checking of the boxes that is this certification program. And I think it doesn't really, it kind of marginalizes, in my opinion, the outreach piece. It's not just outreach. I think political advocacy is really an important part, and even the most important part of what we as Presbyterians, as Christians, can and should be doing in terms of this problem. Holding those most responsible for the climate injustices accountable, doing something other than just within our own group to alleviate the upcoming burdens, to make this problem, to lighten what we're placing on the shoulders of people 10 years out, 20 years out in far distant parts of the world. So I think this shared collective action is really important, to do this actual advocacy out from your congregations, to have some impact on governments, also corporations and private actors. There are various ways that avenues that are now out there for people to adopt. So I think one of the ways that we did that, and along with 400,000 others, was the climate march. That was sort of, that we saw pictures from that, I guess, in the early part of the Advocacy Day. I mean, those were all from this 2014 climate march. What was happening at that time was that the UN, the COPE, was meeting in New York City in the year prior to the Paris Accord. And this became the largest climate mass action to date. I think, arguably it actually pushed Obama to negotiate with the Chinese and come up with a deal before Paris. It did have a significant nudge on those climate negotiators when they saw there was indeed it was the first time that climate actually looked like a mass movement. And one of the unfortunate ways that climate issues developed is it's been mostly top down. The scientists, the international scientists telling the UN and the climate negotiators, and the climate negotiators acting right at the top of the government, but without this sense that there was a grassroots out there. And so they didn't have the political winds at their back until more recently. So this was an important event also for us at Bethany. We had this is our contingent that went. It was also, I think, a transformative moment in what became the climate movement in terms of language. There was a lot more talk than any environmental movement except the environmental justice movement that I've seen, and I'm a historian of environmentalism. There was a lot more talk about justice and inequity. And indeed, the traditional environmental groups were pretty at the margins, and faith groups, we were marching with other faith groups. There was a whole section of the march, devoted faith groups, frontline communities. These are communities at the front line, like people in the Rockaways who were most hit by Superstorm Sandy. I mean, and then people from some of the Gulf Coast communities that are really threatened, labor groups, and so on. So the language, I think, has changed and shifted in a sort of a Christian-friendly direction, because it's about justice, and that has become much more prominent. And it's a pretty joyous thing to be a part of this kind of movement. So I would encourage you all to look for where this is bubbling up. I mean, we got sort of wind that this is going to be a big thing a few months out, a lot of talk, buzz on the internet. And to be a part of this, I think, is also how we can contribute to part of this kind of movement and movement building. One of the consequences also was New York's Climate and Community Protection Act. The New Yorker News, that really became the main advocacy engine for that act, passed in 2019 by the New York State Legislature, actually came together in the course of planning for the New York City Climate March. And out of that has come really this country's most ambitious climate targets, this legislation, 50% reduction by 2013 in greenhouse gases and so on. And there was also an equity piece to that 40% of the public revenue for this would go to environmentally vulnerable low-income communities. So you see the justice angle playing out not just in the rhetoric, but in the actual laws that are being, and it also follows through with the Biden administration, some of its environmentalist justice-minded plan. And we got into lobbying for this, did Bethany folks, lobbying some of our state senators for this. And finally, I think, and yeah, here's where I'm gonna just about done, gonna open it for questions. What can we do today going forward? So I try to think about the avenues that are out there, and I'm sure I've missed some, but one of the ways is actually through this Green Faith group that Jeff and I and some others have been developing a circle out on Long Island. There are circles, I think, in New York City. There are probably actions here this weekend that in which you can take part. It's a little bit sort of short notice, I know, but keep an eye out for this group. This group is actually, this Faith for Action is an international event as well. As we're meeting and talking here, there are also events scheduled all around the country, all around the world, and also on Sunday and Monday as a part of this initiative. So I think there's also, I just read in the paper today that the infrastructure bills, the strongest climate provisions are actually at risk. It sounds like they're going to be left out of that infrastructure bill. And this seems like a good time to exert public pressure, especially if your legislators are reluctant. I guess most legislators in New York City, from New York City, may not be that opposed, but you know, it sounds like we've got our work cut out for us at the national level, in that climate is considered now expendable in terms of the Democratic coalition. Also holding our state leaders responsible. That the next step that New Yorker News was pushing this past year was a Climate and Community Investment Act that actually put our money and sort of tax commitments where our mouth was with the Climate and Community Protection Act. And it also had this equitable transition idea of rebates and so on for lower income groups from this carbon tax. So that is going in the legislature, going to be reintroduced in all likelihood with the next legislative session. And so that's a place where I think we can all get involved. And also holding city, county, and local governments responsible is another place. Finally, I think holding corporations and businesses, the private sector, responsible. Part of that comes through government, and that's why government is such a powerful lever, and why I've emphasized that, because they're the ones who can actually, you know, enforce laws and set, and also they set the terms for markets, and so can create incentives and sort of steer markets in greener directions. There are also campaigns out there for disinvesting in fossil fuels, pension funds, and so on, encouraging disinvestment. There are protests and direct action. You see there's a pipeline now that is now a target for some direct action campaigns. And there are lots of other creative ways that I've seen of applying public pressure on these kinds of issues. So I think there are lots of options out there for advocacy. And really now is the time. I think we're headed into a time when what the government is doing, it looks like the Biden administration is out there sort of acting in the right way, but it faces so many constraints and it is extremely vulnerable politically, just given all the other changes happening. So this is a time also when it has become more dire on the climate front. It's become clearer than ever that that if we don't do something quickly and drastically, that the future is going to look considerably darker in terms of all these disruptions and the effects on the most vulnerable, the least of these. So now is the time to be thinking about and planning and doing something on this issue of climate change. And I'll stop there, and hopefully we have a little bit of time for questions. So.
We do. And so if anybody has a question, I don't have a hand raise function, but you can either put it in the chat or you can just unmute yourself. Please let Chris know who you are before you ask the question. And we have at least 5 minutes, and we'll go until we're out of time as far as the Q&A session. So go ahead and ask now. I'll start with one myself, Chris. One of the things that you see a lot of public action is in the form of boycotts and public shaming of corporations. Do you think that's an effective way to lobby for change? And can you think of examples where that's actually made an impact?
So boycotts yeah, I think it could make a difference. That sort of consumer activism in terms of a boycott. I mean, it's going to be more effective the more people are involved. I mean, as opposed to, I mean, it's a little bit like the sort of fixing my own carbon footprint. But if it becomes, it sort of gets into that territory. But if it actually becomes a collective action and also becomes a way of sort of drawing attention to the issue and creating political pressure, so a very public action that the politicians will see and notice, that I think will make a difference. In a way, that's what the disinvestment campaigns are. So people looking to, like the universities who have been pushed to disinvest in fossil fuel stocks and so on. I mean, that's kind of a variant of what you're talking about. And that has been effective, I think. That has moved the needle because, I mean, I'd like to see it move more, but it has drawn public attention to the issue. And it's really put pressure on key institutions in our society to actually think about this issue, to get out of their sort of customary tracks of how they do things, and has really, I think, made a difference. I think, you know, something like some boycott of like Exxon or something, and I'm not going to use Exxon. I mean, I think that would be, that's a little bit more limited, and I've really seen that kind of campaign emerge. Part of the reason is that, well, if you're not using Exxon, you're using some other gasoline or oil company's product. And so, you know, you're not really, are you really fixing things if you're still in the same category of you know, consumer good? And the real challenge is to shift our whole sort of pattern of consumer goods, what's available. So I think, you know, boycotts, if it's really public, if it's sort of well disseminated and looks like it's sort of this looks like it's going to scale, I think that would be something I would be enthusiastic about pushing. But I'm not really, it's very difficult to do just with something like gas prices or gasoline purchases or some of these other more greenhouse gas producing products.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yep, sure.
Yeah, I'm wondering about divestment within our denomination. Have you had any engagement on the national level with our church as far as divestiture of investments in the fossil fuel industry? And do you see any hope that we might bear witness in that way collectively, as you say, that might have some influence at the level of government where the resistance is, especially in one of our major parties seems to be owned by the fossil fuel industry?
Yeah, I personally have not been involved with that. I mean, I could tell you all the other things I've been involved with, but I have seen that there's another, there has been some movement in that direction, but I would love to see that, and I could I would support it becoming more of a collect. Maybe other people like Jeff know a little bit more about what's happened at the national level in the
Yeah,
president.
the last General Assembly, they actually had an overture to divest. It was narrowly defeated. It will come up again, but yeah, it has been part of our denominational debate. There's a fossil-free PCUSA. If you go on Google, you'll find it. It's part of the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, and they have been active in trying to convince our denomination to divest, because we do have a large portfolio which has included some fossil fuel companies. Good question.
Clive Neal here from Bedford Central Church, Pastor. Want to talk a little bit about, get your reaction on getting African American, African Caribbean people involved in climate change. Sometimes it's perceived to be an upper class behavior concept. And how do we get, you know, minority population involved in talking about being relevant to the reality of the damage of climate change? How do we get to have that conversation so it doesn't always be perceived as a rich person's issue?
Ooh, good question.
Yeah, that is a great question. And, you know, I think I've seen progress on that in the last 10 years or so. And I think a lot of it has to do with speaking, with adopting the language of environmental justice for climate.
Exactly.
Yeah, environmental justice is a movement that grew in reaction to the neglect of, you know, African-American as well as sort of lower income communities by the main environmental groups. And so a whole movement emerged in the 1980s that talked about environmental racism, environmental justice. I think that language has become more frequent in the climate movement, and that was reflected in, for instance, the relatively the significant participation of Blacks as well as whites in the climate march, as well as, you know, Latino, and also in some of these coalitions that have emerged in our part of the country. So, you know, I have hope for that. It is a barrier, though, and I think looking at, for instance, when we're organizing this Green Faith group here on Long Island, I think we have a biracial congregation in Bethany, so I think we have that sort of, we have some you know, a range of folks participating in our climate efforts. But I think getting into it's a very segregated place, Long Island, and Blacks and whites often don't worship together, as you know, that's true across the country. And so you don't really have as many doors into the more majority minority communities and churches and so on. And so that is an issue that I think we have the language, but sort of the language is there, but sort of the more practical connections and networks still have to be built. But I think you know, I'm more hopeful than I was about that.
I think we have about one more minute. So if there's one more question, we might try to answer that. Let me just piggyback real quickly from that last question. Reverend Dr. William Barber and the Poor People's Campaign has started talking a lot more about climate and global warming in the Poor People's Campaign. So you're right, it is being that whole term intersectionality. We're seeing climate being brought into that discussion about economic justice and racial justice.
Okay.
I'd like to add some resources. I've been working for the last decade documenting the climate issue on video, and we have several films that are available for churches to use. And I just put it up in the chat, the page, our homepage that takes you to the resource. It's called olddogdocumentaries.org. Old dogdocumentaries.org. And there are several films on there, the most recent of which is an interview with Joanna Macy, who grew up in New York City as a Presbyterian and who has become a leader and a thought leader and an activist in the climate movement in terms of offering up spiritual, religious view of what informs our change and our activism, what can empower us.
John, if you would please send a copy of that, an email or something to the Justice Ministries group so we can share that. That would be excellent. Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you.
And with that, I think we're out of time. Thank you, everybody. We're going to see everybody again in the next breakout session.